Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Prabha Khetan Foundation, I welcome you all for an Ik Mulakat session with Lady Mohini Kent Noon and the distinguished Dr. Karan Singh ji. Lady Kent's is a heart that bleeds for those trapped in lonely islands of poverty and violence amidst great wealth and prosperity of India. She is a mind that understands the depravity of buying and selling of human beings. She is a spirit that stands stubbornly against trafficking of children. She is a soul that is so steeped in the Indian heritage that all creativity, books, articles, documentaries radiate Indianness. A woman born in India who lives in London and yet seeks a home in different cultures through her multifarious works. Connect these rainbow colored motley dots, and you get the intoxicating and incandescent sketch of Lady Mohini Kent Noon. Lord Vishnu was the preserver of humanity, and Lady Kent, who bears the name of Vishnu's only female avatar, Mohini, has taken on his name as well as his role. She preserves, provides succor, and sustains humankind through her kaleidoscopic capabilities. True to her name, she has been the Mohini and has enchanted all of us through the perfect power of her words, the utter efficacy of her thoughts, and the downright dynamism of her anti human trafficking projects. Perhaps her ability to soak in the dappled cultural worlds of books sensitized her, and she diffused the adolescence of Lily in the exploited lives of human beings that are bought and sold like commodities. She carries with her the Buddhist Zen and the Zen of cooking, not just for the soul, but also for the stomach. Her charismatic creativity has already made the Black Taj more effulgent, the Desi girls more vivacious, and the curry tiffin more succulent. Her new book, Dear Mama, is a gentle but poignant reminder that our mothers are the source of our being. But in the flow and strife of life, we sometimes fail to connect as often as we want. The chasms caused by the catastrophic COVID are bridged in this compilation of letters from eminent personalities to their mothers. We cannot thank you enough for being a role model for young India by epitomizing the word humane. Thank you for your books. Thank you for Lily. And thank you for lighting up our lives today. With a heart overbrimming with elation and emotion, I welcome Lady Mohini Kent amidst us and request her to welcome the dynamic Dr. Karan Singh. It is our fortune, sir, to be amongst the two of you, the powerhouses, the two stalwarts, with passion and purpose, with grit and gumption, with sensitivity and substance. Over to you, Mohini ji, to take this evening forward.
Thank you, Swati. I'm overwhelmed and left speechless by your introduction, which is not a very good start to my own part in this conversation, but thank you. And today we have with us a very special guest. Imagine being born a prince of the fabled land of Kashmir, the land of great gods, great saints and mystics, and beautiful people. It is said that Jesus too went to Kashmir in the missing years of his life to learn yogic siddhis there. Imagine being anointed Maharaja of Kashmir, but he did not stop there. Instead, he went on to create a very unique and powerful life for himself. A very warm welcome to His Highness Dr. Karan Singh, who became a luminous scholar, man of letters, a quiet philosopher, or maybe not so quiet, because we are very well aware of his vast erudition, his many books, his glittering political career, his stewardship of institutions, and his generous support of spiritual projects. a member of parliament for decades, India's ambassador to Washington. He was member of UNESCO Commission on Education in the 21st Century. I was intrigued that he was also part of discussions with spiritual leaders of human survival, and human survival is now uppermost in our minds in this devastating pandemic, which is still killing people. So 1 hour is not very long time to soak in his wisdom. So with your permission, I'll jump straight in and I'll start with my book, if I may. Thank you very much for your letter for my book, Dear Mama, which is in aid of our charity, Lily Against Human Trafficking. So my question is, what did your mother mean to you, and what is the place of mothers in Indian culture? And would you be happy to read out a few lines from your letter in the book?
Mohini, before I answer your question, I
Yes.
want to very warmly commend you and congratulate you for bringing out this marvelous volume.
Thank
Because
you.
without mothers, none of us would be here. And so I think you've done a very good, and I've read through a lot of I know a lot of the people who've written, and it's been really very interesting. So I congratulate you. Also the Prabha Khaitan Foundation. We had Swati Agarwal and Anita Chatterjee. I thank all of you. Am I coming across clearly or vague?
No, your image is not very clear.
Image नहीं है ठीक मेरा बेटा. चलो image मेरा देखो धूमिल हो गया. Anyhow, now and also let me right at the outset. I don't know why my image has suddenly gone fuzzy, but this foundation that you've got, Lily Against Human Trafficking, is really something very, very commendable. I mean, I cannot think of a more cruel, barbaric, and heartless activity than human trafficking. And you say it's $100 billion business.
Annually.
Thousands of children are being trafficked every year. I mean, what a disgrace it is to the human race that after all these years, this is what we've come to, that one of the most lucrative professions in the world is human trafficking. But congratulations, more power to your elbow, keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Now, as far as my mother is concerned, I have given you I've written to you. I'll read out a couple of paragraphs from it if you like.
Please.
I learned a great deal from her. First of all, I learned the beautiful Dogra Pahadi folk songs that she and her serving maids used to sing on festive occasions along with the dholki. Those lilting tunes have remained with me all my life, and I have in fact given new words to them and recorded them for posterity. You must have heard those sort of Pahadi songs.
They're beautiful.
Secondly, she taught me that although I was born a prince, I should always greet everyone with courtesy, regardless of their status, which would include servants and staff. This teaching has stood me in good stead all my life, particularly in a society where the more fortunate tend to look down upon others whom they consider to be inferior. The third important thing that I learned from her was her advice that whatever I have to do in life, I should try to do it to help the poor and less privileged. She used to say that the rich will only want to take your money, while the poor will always appreciate anything that you have done for them. I think that is very, very true. I found that in my own life, that however much you may have done for affluent people, their memory is very short. If you do something also who's really needy, then all their life they remember. Aapne ye kiya tha, aapne ye kiya tha. Even 30 years later, they'll remember that. So this is what I have to say about my your first two questions.
Okay, so you're a great scholar. So my question is that why have women been badly treated in India, where the female Shakti, the Devi, is worshipped?
I know this is a great it's a great conundrum. I have written, in fact, if you see, the gender balance that we find in our scriptures does not unfortunately reflect itself in society. So the scriptures, we worship the goddess Mahakali, Mahalakshmi, Mahasaraswati, and Durga. But in actual life, we don't. This is as a result of centuries of social discrimination and sort of male-dominated society, which has always tended all over the world to push the women into an inferior position. But our constitution is very, very good. It's absolutely equal rights for men and women. And now there's a strong feminist movement, and with people like you working, gradually women are beginning to come into their own in India. I've seen myself in the last 20, 30 years how women now have come up in almost every sphere. When we get the results of the examinations, the civil service examinations, invariably the women are at or near the top. You know, so we have to work. We have to work on this. It's still a work in progress. We've got a great deal more to do. Unfortunately, our scriptural goddesses and our living goddesses, there is really not a proper connection between them.
Agreed. So yours has been an extraordinary life, and we do not know you as primarily as a prince you were born, because you chose to carve out a very strong career path for yourself as a scholar, as a politician, as a statesman. But what is your single most treasured memory from your childhood in Kashmir?
In Kashmir?
Yes.
It was in Nishat Garden, lying on my back and looking up at the chinar tree. That is what I remember. You see, we have in Kashmir these magnificent chinars, as you know. And Nishat Garden, the water was flowing, and I was lying on my back, looking up at the chinar tree. That is a very, very vivid memory.
And do you remember what you were thinking then? Where were your thoughts going?
Well, I was very young at the time. I couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 or 8. I can't really remember my thoughts. But I do distinctly remember this incident of looking up in wonder, as it were, at this huge chinar. As it is, when you're a child, everything looks very big. And the chinars are in fact very big. So it was something quite extraordinary.
And very early on in your life, you came into contact with spiritual guides. Did you seek them out, or was it chance, or was it destiny? And which one of them would you say had the most lasting influence on your spiritual life?
Well, actually, they sought me out. What I found is I've had several spiritual guides. There's a Kashmiri Pandit who was my Shakti Guru, there is worship of the goddess. There were a couple of Englishmen, Gopalda and Ashish Dashi, Krishna Prem and Madhava Ashish in Mirtola. They were my Vaishnava gurus. Shivaya Subramanya, an American in Hawaii, my Shaiva Guru, and Hazrat Vilayat Khan. You know Hazrat Inayat Khan's son, he was my Sufi Guru. So I've had at least 4 gurus, and each one of them have given me a separate mantra. So I've been blessed, shall we say, from a lot of different sources. And I don't think I had to seek them out. I just happened to come across them, if you like.
No, but you responded to them, and you felt no conflict between taking mantras from everyone and practicing.
No conflict at all, because we are all aiming at the same divine. I've been active in the interfaith movement. I believe Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. The Rig Veda says the truth is one, the wise call it by many names. So ultimately, everybody is trying to seek the truth in different ways.
So your thesis was on Sri Aurobindo. You admire his work, and you were chairman of the Auroville Foundation for 3 decades. And I have been a visitor and a pilgrim to Pondicherry for the last 30 years. But you met the mother of Pondicherry, which I never had the honor to do. What is your impression of her? And is that why you were so linked up with Auroville? And you've been very helpful to them.
Well, she was a remarkable woman. It was her imagination and her vision that brought Auroville into being, including that magnificent Matri Mandir.
Yeah.
Every inch of which she herself designed. She was an extraordinary woman. I met her 2 or 3 times, and I was always very impressed with what she was doing. And with her also. I did my thesis on the political thought of Sri Aurobindo. That was mainly a different area from 1905 when he was part of the revolutionary movement. But then he came back to Pondicherry, and it was long after his passing that the mother envisaged Auroville. And yes, that is the reason why I was 20 years chairman of the Auroville Foundation. So I've tried to do my best for Auroville. It's a very unique, you've been there, it's a very unique community. People from 60 different nationalities are living together peacefully, in harmony. It's quite extraordinary.
And do you think that the mother's vision is being realized there? I mean, despite difficulties, which there must have been.
To say, it's very difficult to say, because the whole idea there was that in the ashram, people would do their individual sadhana, so they were sadhakas, that is,
Yes.
people who live in the Aurobindo ashram, and Auroville would be a place for collective sadhana. Now, I cannot really judge whether they've done any collective sadhana or not. Very often when I listen to their problems, it strikes me that they haven't. But I don't want to run them down. Maybe they have. Maybe they have. Individually, I would say, rather than collectively.
Well, I must tell you that I was very fortunate. I met some of the old sadhaks because I've been going there for so long. Duman Bhai, who went there in 1926, Amal Kiran, who went in 1930. Then there was Panditji, Madhav Pandit. And, they were also great beings in themselves. So I was fortunate. But your personal deity is Lord Shiva. And now, is this because you were who you were in Kashmir, or is this your personal choice?
Actually, please go ahead.
No, please.
No, please go ahead. Not ऊंचाई की बात नहीं है, clear नहीं है. ऐसा नहीं करो. और they try to get my रहने दो जैसे है sir. Sorry, boy. I am now a worshipper of Lord Shiva. Nothing to do with Kashmir at all. Although there is a special branch of Indian philosophy known as Kashmir Shaivism.
Correct.
Which is very remarkable, very complex, very difficult branch. Acharya Abhinav Gupta, for example, the great acharyas they produced. But no, this was something quite different. I had some kind of experience where I seemed to see the whole cosmos as the dance. And that brought me immediately to the dance of Shiva. Ananda Kumara Swami's book and others and all. And the Nataraja. I'm particularly impressed. I've made 3 Nataraja temples, Mohini. One in Jammu, in Raghunath Mandir complex. One in North Carolina, in America, in Yogaville. And one in near Pondicherry. Because that image of the dancing Shiva is really quite unique. I mean, that shows the cosmos as it really is. Not a static entity, but constantly changing. That's what the world is constantly changing. We are all changing, even as I speak. Our genes are, or our molecules, whatever they are moving. So the constantly moving universe is captured by the Nataraja.
Have you had much interaction on the basis of quantum physics? Because it seems to be a kind of interpretation of this.
Yes, I have. I've talked with Nobel laureates. I remember talking with Jonas Salk, who is the inventor of the Salk vaccine. I talked with Ilya Prigogine, who got his Nobel Prize in physics. I've read a lot of books. I've talked with Carl Sagan, who is a good friend of mine. And it seems to me that the not the old Cartesian dichotomous science, but the post-Einsteinian, post-Heisenbergian quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
It seems to me to now beginning to reflect some of the insights of the Upanishads.
Correct.
So if you read the Upanishads, you have the same sort of descriptions, which now we find when these people are looking into the atom. It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah. And it's also the observer and the observed, which is,
Yes, yes.
yeah, part of thing. But how do we find a relationship with Lord Shiva? How does one approach him? Because he's got many kind of terrifying aspects too.
Well, no, you see, for example, I wear a thing called Om Namah Shivaya. You know, you can see it or not. My image is so blurred. I don't know why my image is not clear.
I don't know. I mean, what's happened? It was perfectly fine.
Oh, last time your voice was not clear, my image was clear. Now your voice is clear, but my image is better. But better your voice, more important. No, you approach Shiva in his benign form. He has a terrifying form also. So does the goddess, for that matter. The goddess can take terrifying forms, but we approach her in his benign form. Karpur Gauram Karunavataram Sansara Saram Bhujanda. Karpur Gauram, white as camphor, Karunavataram, the incarnation of compassion. So that's how we look upon him. He is easily pleased, Ashutosha, but also he's not to be tampered with. It's not good to have him, on the wild side. So, no, with love and devotion, that's the only way to approach the divine. Whether you approach Jesus Christ, or you approach Hazrat Muhammad, or you approach Vishnu or Goddess or anybody, only love and surrender can bring you there.
So from the cosmic dance of Lord Shiva, I want to move on to the mystic divine dance of the whirling dervishes,
Yes.
Rumi and Shams Tabrizi in Sama. And I want to remind you here that in 2007, it was UNESCO Year of Rumi, and my mother, Amrit Kent, and I did a play on Rumi. My mother translated all the ghazals from Farsi
Yes.
to Hindustani.
Of course.
You were
I
our
was
chief
there.
guest. You were our
Yes, I remember that. I remember that very well. And he was looking for Shamsat Tabriz, of course.
And
It was
the focus of the play was the transformation of Rumi from a cleric into a divine mystic when
Yes.
Shams disappear. So, and he comes to the realization. At the end, Rumi says, I know one, I am one. You know, he comes to this Advaita philosophy actually.
One point I'd like to make here. You know, Rumi wouldn't have been what he became without Shamsat Tabriz.
Mm.
Vivekananda would not have been what he became without Sri Ramakrishna. So the role of the Guru is tremendously important. And Rumi, of course, is marvelous. His Masnavi is known as the Persian Quran. The ecstasy with which he approaches the divine, and the dance of the dervishes. I've seen it here in the Turkish embassy. It's really absolutely go one hand up to heaven and the other one down to the earth, joining the two. And that, you know what that reminds me of? That reminds me of the Ras Leela of Krishna.
Oh,
Not the dance of Shiva. Shiva dance is more this thing. This is whirling dervishes going round and round. The Sheikh reminds me of how it must have been for the gopis going round and round Krishna. And Rumi is one of the great figures in world literature and world religion. And, what can one say about Rumi? One is speechless.
but even after 800 years, you know, his poetry is
Absolutely.
number one, and it's very, very, it just hits you. Even two sentences. I mean, for example, he says, you are not a drop in the ocean. You're the entire ocean in one drop.
Yeah, what a beautiful thing to say.
Two lines.
You know, these for example, the Upanishads were written 5,000 years ago. And yet, when you read them, I was rereading them, I was up in Kashmir for a month. You read them, they're as fresh as ever. He says, Vedahamitam Purusham Mahantam Aditya Varnam Tamasa Parasa. I have seen that great being shining like a sun beyond the darkness. And you know, it really, and Rumi is also like that. And Rumi will always remain relevant. You know, it doesn't matter how many thousand years pass. Rumi is an immortal. He's among the immortals.
That's right. Yeah.
We have great, great regard and respect for him.
Do you read Farsi?
Sorry?
Do you read him in Farsi?
No, I can't. I'm afraid. No, I can't read even Farsi. Do you?
No, my mother could because she was an Urdu scholar, but I can't. My language is English. I'm a product of convent schools. You know?
I'm a product of the Doon school.
Doon schools, oh, that's the same culture.
Almost.
But did your Sufi Peer, did he, or your Murshid, I think, did he introduce you to Rumi? Is that what was your introduction?
To Sufism, you know, I met Peer Vilayat Khan. You remember Peer Inayat Khan was a great musician who
Right.
took a lot of music to the West. His
Correct.
son Peer Vilayat Khan, I happened to meet him at an interfaith meeting. And he was a remarkable man. He gave me this book called Awakening. That's his book.
Okay.
And he was a Sufi. He leads the Sufi movement in Europe. He is now passed away. His son is now doing that. And they introduced me to this, to the deeper elements of
Of
Sufism,
Sufism, right.
and how the Sufi is suffused with that. You see, I'm very glad you bring up this because you see, in a way, there are two faces of Islam also.
Yeah.
On the one hand, the very strong and then to the extent of being fanatical and very cruel and extremely what should I say, terrifying view. And then you have these Sufis who are full of love and full
Love.
of humanity. And the biggest Muslim shrine outside of Makkah and Medina itself is the Dargah of Gharib Nawaz Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti in Ajmer.
Hmm.
And I come, of course, from Kashmir. Now, Kashmir was the home of Rishi. We used to go to Chirare Sharif, to Baba Rishi, to Mahmood Sahab. Like we used to go to our own temples, or like I go to the Darbar Sahab.
Yeah.
We used to go to these Sufi shrines. The Sufi shrines are the essence of Islam, not the mosque so much. The mosque is all right, you can pray there and you can spend a lot of money on the mosque. But the shrine is where the saint is buried.
Mm.
The Dargah is where the saint is buried. So the vibrations that you get from a shrine are totally different from what you get simply in a place, a hall of worship.
Right. I might mention here that I did a conversation with the head of the Inayat Khan order now. He's his American, and I gave it the title Fellow Travelers on the Path. And Shri M was part of that, and the head of the Qadiri order, and the head, and this gentleman, his name is David Less, but his Sufi name is something else. And we had a very good conversation about Sufism online. Yes.
I wish in India we could stress Sufism so that this other face of Islam, which is becoming some kind of a prototype. You know, when you talk of Islam, you think of the Taliban and you think of that. That's very unfortunate because this softer part of Islam, the loving part of Islam, is forgotten. And
well, they're much more aggressive and loud. And when Margaret Thatcher, after 9/11, she was told that this is not the majority view, but she said, "Where is the majority? I don't hear them." So this is, we have to bring out other facets.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
So this is, and Sufis belong, even if you go to here, the Dargah of Hazrat Nizamuddin Chishti in Delhi.
Correct.
Lakhs of people go there of all communities. I mean,
That's
Hindus,
right. Yeah.
Muslims, everybody, Christians, everybody goes there.
My mother and I used to sometimes go for the Qawwalis on Jumme ki Raat.
Especially Qawwalis, they have it. On about me, they have a program.
But coming from Rumi to the other great divine mystic of Persia, this is, Hafiz Shirazi. Now he said, he wrote, "I have learned so much from God that I can no longer call myself a Christian, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Jew. What do you feel is the role of religion today?
Well, you may know that I've been involved in the interfaith movement for 4 decades. I head an organization known as the Temple of Understanding. It was started by an American woman, Judith Hollister. I don't know whether you ever came across her. She founded it 50 years ago. And then I finally joined it and became chairman, international chairman. And I started a chapter in India, a separate India foundation. Now, the interfaith movement, they have all these congresses and all. Started with Vivekananda. In 1893, the first Parliament of the World's Religions was held in Chicago.
Yes.
And 100 years later, they held it again in Chicago in 1993. And from that time, I have been involved with them. I've attended dozens of meetings and conferences around the world. They're doing good work. The only problem is that people will spend crores of rupees on mosques, on temples, on gurdwaras, but interfaith is nobody's baby. You know, so whereas the other, the actual, they have lots of funds, the interfaith is languishing. But we are still continuing to our efforts to bring people together, not in a shastra, not to prove which one is superior, but simply to try and understand each other. We must begin to understand, because the prototypes that we have in our minds are very rigid. So the only way we can get over those prototypes is if we meet with each other, if we talk with each other. And interfaith prayers, I find, are very, very important. For example, if in this room I have 10 people belonging to 10 different religions, they're all praying, it becomes obvious that they cannot be praying to 10 different deities. They must be praying to the same divinity. The divinity can take 1,000 forms.
Yeah.
As you know, we believe, the Sikhs don't believe in form, the Muslims don't believe in form, the Arya Samajis don't believe in form, but the Sanatan Dharma, we believe in form. We cherish and love the beautiful forms, whether of Krishna, whether of the goddess. So you can worship a god with form, without form, if you like. You don't have to have a form. So, these are things which must be understood. I tell my Muslim friends, आपके इस्लाम में 99 words है ना, there are 99 names of Allah. तो ये समझ दो हमारे यहाँ 99 forms of Muhammad. That's the only difference. You have a name, we have a form. Once you understand that basic idea, then they should not be confused. It's very unfortunate that once again these communal clashes are beginning to occur. And that is something which we must never allow. The whole partition of India, you know your family, and we've all lived through the horrors of the partition, which took place on the basis of religion.
Yes.
Let's face it. We pretend that that is not the case. The fact of the matter is, it was because Jinnah demanded a separate Muslim state. That's why the nation had to be partitioned. And the terrible suffering, people have forgotten how millions of people were moved from one country to another. Now, tens of thousands were massacred on either side. That's what happens when communalism gains the upper hand. We have to be very careful that we continue the syncretic tradition of the Vedanta, of the Upanishads, which to my mind are the supreme texts of Hinduism.
Since you've brought up the question of partition, and mine is a Sikh family, and Sikhs and Sindhis and some other communities suffered much more than others. But I feel that there isn't enough awareness, because I think there was 16 million people were displaced.
I know.
Moved. And there was this English policeman, he was a soldier who had been posted at Auschwitz, and he was posted to Punjab after that, and he said he had never seen such brutality. Do you think this has been airbrushed out of our history? Do you think we should have been taught more about this chapter in national?
Yes. You see, that is, we celebrate, and rightly so, we celebrate our independence. We're very happy. But I always say, whenever I'm speaking, do not forget the price that was paid for independence. And we were not violent against the British. We were violent against each other.
Correct.
And the horrible price, the Hindus and Sikhs that were massacred in the Punjab, for example, and there were massacres of the Muslims also in Bihar and so on, is unbelievable brutality. Now the question is whether we should bring it up, face it, or whether we should just try and airbrush it, as you say. They're both theories. One theory is that bringing it up will simply revive old hatreds and old memories. And all. The other theory is that no, we have to face up to what happened. And it's only if we face it that we can come to terms with it. So this is a very vexed question, Mohini. I don't know, what is your view on this?
My view is that I think people, I've addressed this a little bit in my novel, The Black Taj. And what my understanding is that the trauma lived on in individuals, and they never got any counseling. There was no healing. Nobody recognized what had happened, and it lived through them and onto the next generation. Because I'll give you a very small personal example. My sister's husband, Dr. Harish Moorjani. The Moorjanis were a family from Sindh, and they were a middle-class family. And somebody called Mir went there and just grabbed their houses. But he had promised a Sardar in Delhi not to kill anyone. So he said, I'll let you go. They took a train, and the train, his father, Kishan Moorjani, had been a kind of a Boy Scout. So he got a letter from the English authorities, which was like a safe pass. The train was stopped, the lights were out, the mobs came onto the street, but that Mir had given them 2 of his men to escort them to Delhi. And they showed the letter, and because of the letter, they were spared. But this boy of 11 or 12 saw the massacres in the train. He saw them happening on the station. He saw a pregnant woman's stomach being slit and all sorts of things. He died in January this year in America, but till his last day, he was having nightmares about what he saw then. And this anxiety, he communicated it to his children. So unless this mental health issue, which has become a big subject in the pandemic, but nobody addressed the trauma, and the trauma lived on in people who had seen it.
Even though three generations have passed since then, but even then the trauma comes down. Because I know the people whose ancestors had to leave, they are all very bitter. They have this bitterness in their hearts against the Muslims. And I think the same thing may be true in Pakistan. I don't know what position there is.
There is.
It's a very delicate thing, when it's really very delicate. How do you bring it up? You cannot ignore it, definitely. You have to let the people know the price that we paid for independence. Three states were partitioned: Bengal and Punjab de jure, Jammu and Kashmir de facto. These are the 3 states, and this is where all the killing took place.
That's right. It's like I have a very large number of Jewish friends in London, but there are Holocaust deniers, for example. But if you don't talk about it, and you don't, it's part of it happened. It's not that we are inventing or embroidering something, it happened. So it's ironic that, something that was a physical event is too delicate,
But add to the terrible history, the 1984 anti-Sikh riots in Delhi.
Correct.
That is something which is. I was in Delhi at the time, and my sister-in-law Bharti is married to Moni Chadha. You may know them, foreign service. So we had to go and bring him and Bharti and Moni and their children to our house here. I mean, it is unbelievable that this thing could explode like this. And people who were friends the other day would actually kill. I mean, I don't understand. Human nature is so complex, and there there are wells of compassion and there are wells of hatred also. How
But
did they do that?
what happened was unpardonable, because at least the security of life is a very minimum the state has to guarantee its citizen.
That is the shame and a disgrace. वो धब्बा रहेगा दिल्ली के ऊपर हमेशा के लिए. 1984 में जो हुआ, we can never get over that dhabba.
I went to one of the camps to distribute clothes, and they were largely Sindhi women. And it was horrible. I just saw these poor things, you know, Sikhs and Sindhis whose ancestors, grandfathers, and all may have suffered in the partition, to relive that nightmare again in a safe country. You know, it's.
And you know, my family is very close to the Sikhs because our family rose to power because of Maharaja Ranjit Singh.
Yeah, correct.
My ancestor, Raja Gulab Singh, उसको राज तिलक महाराज साहब ने खुद दिया अपने हाथ से. On the banks of the Chenab in 1822, 200 years ago almost, he gave Raj Tilak to my ancestors. And something very interesting was, he gave the Raj Tilak like this. So the Pandit said, "Nee, Mal, you do it like." He said, "No, मैं चाहना कि इसी जेडी निया न मजबूत रहन."
मजबूत हो.
And उन्होंने परिवार खत्म हो गया, लेकिन रब दी मेहर नाल साडा चल रहा है. We can never forget our debt to the Sikhs. And now, of course, I'm related to the Sikhs. My granddaughter was married 3 years ago to Amarinder Singh's grandson.
Okay.
My sister-in-law is married to a Sikh. My granddaughter is married. We just had a baby girl.
How nice.
So my great-granddaughter, my first great-grandchild.
Congratulations.
You know, the Sikhs, I mean, for us, they're part of our soul and our system. And this was really terrible. In 1984, you talk of 1947. Look at this, 1984.
Correct. Yeah.
In our own lifetimes, we've seen it.
That's right. But we were talking about this being part of our education system, or at least being talked about. But let's talk about our broader education system, because people like me are also a product of, Macaulay's vision of what India should be.
Go on to that, I must say, why did this all lead up to Blue Star? We have to see that also. There was a situation in which Hindus were being pulled out of buses and shot. I don't want to go into the names and the background. So wherever there's fanaticism, ultimately it leads to disaster. There was somebody who wanted to become a great leader in Sikhism. He ended up by getting the Sikhs destroyed.
Correct.
Prabhakaran in Sri Lanka wanted to become a leader of the Tamils. He ended up by getting the Tamils destroyed. Hitler wanted to become a ruler of the world. He ended up by getting the whole of Germany flattened. So wherever fanaticism takes over, remember, ultimately uska parinam bada khatarnak hota hai. It's a very bad end. But please proceed with the question.
No, I might just add here, which was said at the time of the French Revolution, that the revolution devours its own children.
Yes, absolutely.
Again and again, we've seen it, as you illustrated.
Robespierre was taken to the guillotine himself.
Right, yeah. And they all were finally decimated. But I mentioned in the introduction your, engagement with UNESCO and education in the 21st century.
Yes.
Now, India, of course, it was a very deliberate imperial policy to take away all funding from local school, which is Sanskrit, and which is, the Rishi and Munis, or wherever the hermitages, whatever was happening. And all the resources were poured into English. And we have lived with that system, and we have continued with that system. But now, sort of 70 years later, what do you think? How do you think we need? And we actually scoffed at our own heritage, the wisdom of the rishis.
You're talking of UNESCO. They've just brought out a lovely book called Incredible Treasure, UNESCO World Heritage Sites of India. You must try and get a copy from UNESCO. It's beautifully illustrated. And I just got it yesterday from the local UNESCO representative. I was on the board for 8 years, and it's a very distinguished board. Radhakrishnan was on it, Dr. Saab and all Indra was on it. UNESCO is trying to do its bit. But, for example, heritage, tangible and intangible heritage also they're doing. From the Rig Vedic recitations are intangible heritage. So they're doing their bit. But the broader question that you raise with regard to education, you see, Macaulay is much maligned. But the fact is that a lot of people like us who've gone through the English education system have made a mark in the world. We've had Nobel laureates. I mean, if our situation, if our education was so bad, how come we win Nobel Prizes? How come we write world famous novels? So it isn't as if we've got to scrap the whole situation. I agree with you when you say that Vedantic wisdom in our school syllabus. It's very strange that you say that. Just today, I sent a book to Kasturi Rangan, who is Dr. Kasturi, who wrote the National Education Policy, he was the chairman, and he's doing the syllabus. And I am sending this book called All Love Flows to the Self. These are stories from the Upanishads, beautifully told, each one with a very uplifting model. So these sort of stories could be introduced into the curriculum. You don't have to teach religion. We are not allowed to teach religion. Please remember our constitution forbids us from teaching religion. But that doesn't mean that you cannot teach stories from the Upanishad. You cannot teach uplifting stories from all the texts of religious texts. So what I think we need to do is have an injection of wisdom into the, and now of course education is going totally out of hand, it's become entirely digital now. I haven't even learned how to use this machine. I don't know whether you've done it or not. Mail to chal raha nahi, I can't do it. Because I'm a pre-computer generation. But I mean, youngsters won't believe that human civilization existed quite happily for 5,000 years without the computer. They can't live without the computer. There were no computers when you and I grew up. When I grew up in school, there was no computer, there was no television. It was all here, as they say in the ad, Kochi se Sochi mein dala. There's somebody asked me, Kochi mein dala, main Kochi se Sochi mein dala. You got to put it here. And therefore, the over-dependence on technology is also beginning to have a negative effect.
Yeah.
Remember that. Children who can no longer, they can't do simple sums. If you give a simple sum, but they can't do it in their heads, like we had to do it in our heads. So, memory. I asked students to recite a poem. I mean, I love this recitation, I can recite all night. But that's a divine gift, that's all I can say. But I think that we need a combination of our ancient wisdom, modern pedagogical methods, and that commission report that you mentioned that I was a member of, the UNESCO Commission for Education in the 21st Century, that has a lot of very useful pointers, many of which have been incorporated in our new national education policy, which is now just on the verge of being implemented.
Wonderful.
So I see we should do it.
That's wonderful.
Not an anti-English view, or not just a pro-public school.
Right. Can I ask you, we are almost out of time. We have a few moments left. What was the worst memory of your life?
The worst memory. Okay, I'll tell you. I remember it was in October 1947. I had this problem with my hip. I was in plaster Paris for 18 months. Plaster Paris cast, flat on my back. Can you imagine at the age of 16? I was 6 months and I was sent to America. I was again, then I had an operation, I have a nail in my hip, And I had come back and I was getting better. I was driving out, and it rained, and a bus came and hit the car like that. And I broke the other leg was broken like this, 90 degrees. That was the worst moment in my life. It was just in front of a military hospital, so I was virtually carried into the hospital. And then
Gosh.
how, you know, that is the worst moment of my life.
Did you go back to America again for surgery?
No. Then I was treated entirely in India, you know, by Dr. Mulgaonkar and Dr. Chini. They were very famous orthopedic surgeons. They
Right.
looked after me all right. And I was married very soon. I used the sword as a walking stick. While I was going around the fire, I said, how am I going to manage? But Bapuji was very keen that I should get married. And he'd fixed a date and no, Tiger. Anyhow, I did get well enough to walk around.
Yeah.
In fact, at one stage, he had to get up and tell Asha, Aste chalo, aste chalo. She was going too fast. And we were very young when we were married, you know. I was 19 and
Yes.
Asha was 13.
You know, I met you both once when I was a teenager with my mama, who you knew, but I remember her very vividly. She was so beautiful that it left a kind of indelible impression on my mind.
Yes.
And so lovely lady. But who would you say is the most outstanding personality you met? And this is not necessarily somebody famous, but somebody who actually
Oh,
left
there
influenced you.
very clearly, there are two people. There's Jawaharlal Nehru. He was my idol. He was my mentor. I grew up reading his books, Discovery of India, his autobiography, and he also called me Tiger. My pet name was Tiger. All his letters to me are my dear Tiger. There's a book this thick, my correspondence with him. He guided me, and he was a remarkable personality. If you walk into a room, the room would suddenly come alive. He was very, very charismatic. He was one in politics. In spiritual life, it was Sri Krishna Prem.
Sri
This
Krishna.
Englishman who was also in the Air Force at one stage,
Yes.
man of great wisdom, great humor. He's written these marvelous books, Yoga of the Bhagavad Gita and Yoga of the Kathopanishad. And he was, I think, the most remarkable spiritual leader that I met. I don't want to compare them because they're all different, but he in his own way was unique. So I would say these two people are the most outstanding that I've met.
I've read about him, but I've never read anything by him. Did he live near Almora or?
Mirtola, a place called Mirtola,
Huh.
just about a few kilometers beyond Almora. Beautiful ashram, still going strong. But he was a remarkable man. I was very fortunate. I met a lot of extraordinary people. I met Nelson Mandela, for example. I went there, Nelson Mandela, who was also a remarkable man. And Nelson Mandela was living. I met him soon after he had come out of jail. No bitterness at all. Not at all. I met Mahatma Gandhi. You know, I must be one of the few people alive who actually met Mahatma Gandhi, because when he came to see Bapuji
Yes.
in Srinagar in June of 1947, I was on a wheelchair. My father and mother were there. I insisted on being present.
Mm.
So my wheelchair was wheeled in, and I sat through the meeting. And there's a plaque in that chinar tree in the Palace Hotel. This is where Mahatma Gandhi came and where he met Maharaja Hari Singh, Maharani Tara Devi, and Yuvraj, now Dr. Karan Singh.
And did he say anything to you? Do you remember? Achha.
Sardar Patel, I knew. I mean, Maulana Azad, किस का नाम लूं?
I know.
एक से एक बढ़ के Maulana साहब was such a joy to speak with him. उनके साथ गुफ्तगू करना ही एक, समझिए, was a blessing.
I think we'll have to have another session about your reminiscence of all these great people you met.
Yes.
But right now, Swati has popped up like a red flag.
Okay. All right, Swati. Well, anyhow,
And
thank you, Mohini. Thank you for having me.
but it's been a fascinating 1 hour. It's flown by. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this. And So Swati, over to you.
I'm so sorry. I just did not want to intrude and I wanted to keep hearing the guftgoo which Dr. Karan Singh and Mohini ji were having. It was such an enlightening evening with your ideas and thoughts. But mountains do not rise without earthquakes. So every time I meet a strong person like you both, I ask, what struggles have you seen? What hurdles have you vanquished? We are blessed that these two glorious personalities have shared their stories, which were stimulating, stirring, inspiring all of us to fight demons within and without and emerge taller, fiercer, and deeper. Yes, there is a seamy side to societies. We are all appalled at the injustices, but it takes a Mohini Kent to infuse and enthuse everyone to save humanity. We all want globalization, but it takes a Karan Singh to sound the trumpet call for India. I am grateful to both these visionaries for gracing this evening. I'm thankful to them for giving us a peek into the meaningful compilation of Dear Mama. But most importantly, I'm gratified for the fueling of our spirits. Let's hope another revolution comes out from this magnificent sharing of experiences. On behalf of Prabha Khaitan Foundation, I thank you all for being with us. Thank you so much. Stay happy, stay safe.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Swati.
Swati. Thank you, Mohini.
Thank you, Ji. Okay. So, anyone else? Anandita coming on, or shall we just wind up?
I think we are good.
Can we cut off now?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.